before we start tonight's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it? I love knowing who's still around the campfire with me. Drop a comment below if you're not too scared. Now get cozy and let the rain lead you into the dark. Have you ever been camping in the Florida Everglades? I wouldn't recommend it. Not after what happened to me last summer. The rain's been drumming against my window for hours now, just like it did that night. The steady patter always takes me back there, to that wretched patch of swampland where everything changed. I haven't told many people this story. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, but perhaps you will. I've been working myself ragged at my publishing job in Miami for nearly 3 years without a proper holiday. My therapist suggested I reconnect with nature to address my chronic anxiety. Ironic advice in retrospect, when my mate Duncan rang to invite me on a camping weekend in the Everglades. It seemed like perfect timing. Just a small group of us, Duncan, his girlfriend Ellie, and me. A bit of fishing, a campfire, and proper disconnection from the digital world. No reception, no emails, just what the doctor ordered. We set off on a Friday afternoon in Duncan's weathered Land Rover. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but nothing severe, just a light summer shower. The meteorologist had said with that plastic smile they all seemed to have. By the time we reached the outskirts of the national park, the sky had darkened considerably. Might be in for a bit more than a sprinkle, Duncan muttered, peering up to the windscreen at the gathering clouds. Ellie, seated beside him, squeezed his arm reassuringly. "We've camped in worse," she said. "Remember Colorado?" They shared a knowing look and laughed. I felt that familiar twinge of being third wheel, but pushed it aside. I was here for the solitude anyway. We stopped at a ranger station to register our campsite. The place was practically deserted except for an elderly ranger with deeply tanned skin and silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. His name badge read Frank. "You folks heading into the backcountry tonight?" he asked, eyeing our gear as Duncan filled out the paperwork. "That's right," Duncan replied cheerfully. "Site 27 near Gator Creek." The ranger's weathered face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Site 27? You sure about that?" "Positive. Booked it online last month." Frank glanced at his computer screen, then back at us. "System shows it's available, but..." He trailed off, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "That area has been experiencing some unusual wildlife activity lately. Might want to consider one of our lakeside sites instead. They're much more scenic." Duncan looked at Ellie, who shrugged. "We're set on backcountry, mate," he said. "We want the authentic experience." Frank sighed, stamping our permit with perhaps more force than necessary. "Your choice. Just remember, stay on marked trails, store your food properly, and under no circumstances wander off alone at night." He looked directly at me as he said this last part, his pale blue eyes unervingly intense. "Is there something specific we should be concerned about?" I asked, unable to shake the feeling that he wasn't telling us everything. Frank hesitated. "Nothing I can officially warn you about," he said finally. "But locals don't camp near Gator Creek anymore. Not since the disappearances." "Disappearances?" Ellie echoed, suddenly interested. "Just some hikers who wandered off trail a few years back." Frank said dismissively, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Probably got disoriented in the swamp. Happens sometimes." He handed us our permit and a map with our campsite circled in red. "Follow the Sawgrass Trail for about 3 miles, then take the fork toward Gator Creek. You'll see the markers for Site 27. And remember what I said, don't wander off alone." As we walked back to Land Rover, I couldn't help asking, should we be concerned about what he said? Duncan waved it off. Park rangers always overstate the dangers. Makes the tourist respect the wilderness more. He tossed our permit onto the dashboard. Besides, we're experienced campers. We'll be fine. The first drops of rain began to hit the windscreen as we drove deeper into the park. By the time we reached the trailhead, it had developed into a proper downpour. We donned our waterproofs and headlamps before shouldering our packs. The rain drummed steadily on the hood of my jacket as we set off along the Sawgrass Trail. The Everglades at dusk is an eerie place. The swampland stretched out on either side of the raised trail. Cypress trees draped with Spanish moss creating strange, human-like silhouettes in the fading light. The rain intensified the peculiar stillness, dampening all sounds except for the constant patter on leaves and the occasional splash of something moving in the water. Our headlamps carved weak cones of light through the gathering darkness. "It's beautiful out here," Ellie murmured, but her voice held a note of uncertainty. We trudged on for what felt like hours, the darkness becoming absolute except for our headlamps. The rain never let up, sometimes easing to a drizzle before turning to a steady downpour. My boots were soaked through despite their waterproofing, and my socks squelched with every step. "Should be just ahead," Duncan said, consulting the soggy map under the beam of his headlamp. "There's the fork." We turned onto a narrower trail that wound deeper into the cypress forest. The trees grew closer together here, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to press down on us. Without warning, my headlamp flickered, then went out entirely. "Bloody hell," I muttered, stopping to dig through my pack for spare batteries. "You two go ahead. I'll catch up." "No way," Duncan said firmly. "Remember what Frank said. We stick together." I found the batteries and quickly replaced them, but the lamp still wouldn't turn on. "Must be the rain," I said resignedly. "It's fine. I'll just stay between you two." We continued more slowly now, with me sandwiched between Duncan and Ellie, trying to see by the spillover from their lights. The trail narrowed further, forcing us to walk single file, with Duncan leading the way. "There, I see the marker," he called back, pointing ahead to a small reflective sign nailed to a tree. "Site 27. We followed him off the main trail and into a small clearing surrounded by cypress trees. It wasn't ideal. The ground was soggy and there were no elevated areas to pitch our tents, but it was too dark and wet to... "Let's get the tents up quickly," Duncan said, already shrugging off his pack. Working by the light of their headlamps, we managed to erect both tents. Duncan and Ellie would share the larger one, while I had the smaller one to myself. Originally, we'd planned to build a campfire, but everything was too wet. Instead, we retreated to our respective tents with a hurried goodnight. Inside my tent, I peeled off my wet outer layers and changed into relatively dry clothes. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the tent fly, creating a sound that would normally be soothing but now felt somehow ominous. I checked my mobile out of habit. No signal, as expected. I set it aside and burrowed into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the trek. Despite my fatigue, sleep proved elusive. Every sound seemed amplified. The dripping of water from the trees, the distant call of a night bird, the occasional splash from the swamp, and underneath it all, a strange whispering sound, like voices just below the threshold of comprehension. I told myself it was just the rain on leaves, or perhaps the wind through the cypress branches. But there was no wind, and the whispering seemed to have a cadence to it, rising and falling like conversation. After what felt like hours, I must have drifted off, because I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud splash, much closer than the others had been. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the sound of the rain. Splash. There it was again. Something was moving in the water near our campsite. Probably just an alligator, I whispered to myself, or a large fish. But even as I said it, I knew the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic for random animal movement. Splash, splash, splash. It was moving around the perimeter of our campsite. I fumbled for my headlamp before remembering it wasn't working. Instead, I grabbed my mobile and turned on its torch function, directing the beam toward the tent wall. The light revealed nothing but the green nylon of the tent, beaded with moisture. The splashing stopped. For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain. Then, unmistakably, I heard the squelch of wet footsteps on the muddy ground. Something was walking around our campsite. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps circled slowly, pausing occasionally before continuing. They didn't sound like an animal. They sounded human, or at least humanoid, a deliberate bipedal gait. Should I call out to Duncan and Ellie? What if it was just one of them getting up to use the toilet? But somehow, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were wrong, too slow, too careful, as if whatever was making them was trying not to be heard. The footsteps approached my tent, then stopped directly outside. I could hear breathing now, not the normal sound of human respiration, but a wet, labored rasp, like someone whose lungs were partially filled with fluid. My heart hammered, so loudly I was certain it could be heard outside the tent. Sweat broke out across my body, despite the cool night air. I clutched my mobile tighter, its light now seeming pitifully inadequate. Something brushed against the side of the tent. A light touch at first, then more insistent, like fingers probing for an opening. I watched in silent horror as an indentation formed in the tent wall, the nylon stretching inward as if pushed by an unseen hand. The whispering I'd heard earlier returned, louder now, and clearly coming from whatever was outside my tent. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. The sounds were liquid and bubbling, like someone trying to speak underwater. The indentation moved across the tent wall, tracing a path toward the zippered entrance. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to cry out or move. The zipper began to tremble, then slowly, agonizingly, began to open from the outside. In that moment, my paralysis broke. I lunged forward, grabbing the zipper and yanking it shut. Whatever was on the other side pulled back. Stronger than me, we struggled for control, the zipper moving up and down an inch at a time. Duncan, I finally managed to shout. Ellie, there's someone outside. The tugging on the zipper stopped abruptly. The whispering ceased. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and my own ragged breathing. Then a new sound, the unmistakable rip of nylon from the other side of the tent. Something sharp was cutting through the fabric. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the opposite wall of the tent. My hand found the small pocket knife I kept in my pack. I flicked it open, the blade laughably small against whatever threat awaited. A long, pale hand pushed through the tear in the tent. It was human in basic shape, but wrong in every detail. The fingers too long and jointed in too many places, the skin glistening and translucent like that of a cave-dwelling creature. Water dripped from it onto my sleeping bag. I slashed at it with my knife, catching it across what would be the palm on a human hand. There was no blood, only a clear, viscous fluid that oozed from the wound. The hand withdrew with a sound that might have been pain or might have been rage. Duncan, I screamed again, louder this time. Wake up. The hand returned, now joined by another, both tearing the opening, widening it. I caught glimpses of what waited outside. A hunched, pallid figure, taller than humans should be, its features obscured by the darkness and rain. I abandoned all thought of fighting. In one desperate movement, I lunged to the tent entrance, unzipping it and bursting outside into the pouring rain. I sprinted toward Duncan and Ellie's tent, not daring to look back. "Wake up," I shouted, clawing at their tent zipper. "We need to go. Now!" There was no response. With growing horror, I managed to open their tent enough to shine my mobile light inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags were there, laid out neatly, but Duncan and Ellie were gone. I spun around, frantically scanning the campsite with my light. The beam caught something at the edge of the clearing. Duncan's headlamp lying in the mud. Next to it was Ellie's, both still switched on but pointing in different directions. A sound behind me, that same wet, shuffling footstep. I whirled around, and my light fell upon it fully for the first time. It's difficult to describe what I saw. My mind doesn't want to reconstruct the image, as if doing so might somehow summon it again. It stood on two legs, yes, but there the resemblance to humanity largely ended. Its skin was the color and texture of a drowned corpse, with patches missing to reveal glistening tissue beneath. Its face was elongated, fish-like, with eyes too large and round, reflecting my light like a deer caught in headlights. But it was a mouth that haunted me most, a wide, lipless gash filled with needle-like teeth, stretched now into what might have been a smile in one of its misshapen hands. It clutched something that dripped dark fluid onto the ground, something I desperately tried not to recognize as human. I ran. God help me. I ran without looking back. I abandoned everything, my tent, my pack, my friends. I splashed through the swamp, no longer caring about staying on the trail, driven only by the primal need to escape. Branches clawed at my face and arms. Unseen roots tried to trip me. The rain continued to pour, washing away any sense of direction. Behind me, I heard it giving chase, that same splashing gait, but faster now, no longer trying to be stealthy. And worse, I heard others joining it, similar sounds coming from different directions, converging on my position. They were hurting me. This realization hit with sickening clarity. They weren't just chasing me. They were driving me toward something. I tried to change direction, but each time I did, splashing sounds would cut me off, forcing me back on their chosen path. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. My lungs burned. My legs grew heavy. But terror kept me moving, even as I began to recognize the futility of escape. Eventually, I broke through a line of cypress trees and found myself in a larger clearing. Unlike the rest of the swamp, this area seemed strangely dry, despite the continuing rain. In the center stood what appeared to be the remains of a building, a small wooden structure, weathered and rotting, partially reclaimed by the swamp. The splashing sounds had stopped. I stood at the edge of the clearing, gasping for breath, my mobile light trained on the decrepit building. Something about it radiated wrongness. The rain seemed to fall around it, but not on it. The very air above it appeared distorted, as if looking through imperfect glass. I knew with absolute certainty that I should not approach that building. Whatever was driving me toward it wanted me to enter, and whatever they wanted could only mean my destruction. With the last reserves of my strength, I turned and plunged back into the swamp, choosing a direction at random. I expected to hear pursuit resume, but there was nothing but the rain and the sound of my own desperate movement. I don't remember much of what followed. I ran until I physically couldn't, then stumbled and crawled. Somewhere along the way, I lost my mobile, my last source of light. I continued in darkness, guided only by blind instinct. Dawn found me lying half submerged at the edge of a canal miles from our campsite. A passing airboat with early morning tourists spotted me and alerted the authorities. I was suffering from exposure, dehydration despite the rain, and numerous cuts and abrasions. But I was alive. The search for Duncan and Ellie began immediately. Park rangers, police, and volunteers combed the area around Site 27 for days. They found our campsite mostly intact. My tent with its mysterious tear, Duncan and Ellie's tent empty but undisturbed. Of Duncan and Ellie themselves, there was no sign. The official report concluded they had likely wandered off in the night, perhaps to seek better shelter from the rain, and become disoriented in the swamp. Their bodies were never recovered. I tried to tell the authorities what I'd seen. They listened patiently, then gently suggested that my experience was a result of panic, confusion, and possible hallucinations brought on by hypothermia. Even Ranger Frank, when interviewed, denied ever warning us about disappearances near Gator Creek. We haven't had any missing persons reports in that area for years, he told investigators, looking directly at me with those same pale blue eyes. But there was something in his gaze, a knowledge, a warning perhaps, that told me he remembered our conversation differently. In the months since, I've researched the history of the Everglades extensively. I found scattered, obscure references to an indigenous tribe that once inhabited the region, but vanished suddenly in the early 1800s. The few accounts from Spanish explorers describe them as people of the deep water, who practiced strange rituals involving human sacrifice. More disturbing are the occasional reports throughout the years, always dismissed or explained away, of campers and hikers encountering pale figures in the swamp during rainstorms, always during the rain, as if the sound of water somehow masks their movements or perhaps enables them. I haven't told many people my story. Those I have told react with sympathy but obvious disbelief. I'm seeing a therapist again, working to what she calls survivor's guilt and traumatic stress. She's probably right, at least partially. But I know what I saw, and I know they're still out there, waiting in the swamp for the next rainy night. The next group of campers who ignore the warnings. It's still raining outside my window. Sometimes, when it rains like this for hours on end, I imagine I can hear that liquid whispering again, just below the drumming of the raindrops. And sometimes when I look out the sheets of falling water, I think I can see pale, elongated figures moving between the drops. Are you listening to this in the rain? Look outside. Look carefully between the raindrops. And whatever you do, don't go camping in the Everglades. Not when it's raining. The rain against my window always brings it all back. That rhythmic patter. It's like a code, you know? A message from something ancient trying to communicate through water droplets. Most people find the sound of rain soothing. I used to as well. Now it just reminds me of what waits beneath the Everglades. I was a field researcher, a hydrology PhD student studying water flow patterns in wetland ecosystems. The Everglades was my laboratory, my passion. I'd spent 3 years collecting data across various regions of the park, documenting how water moved through that vast, mysterious ecosystem. It was important work. Climate change and human development were altering the delicate balance of the river of grass, as we call it. My research could help inform conservation efforts. My final expedition was meant to be a routine 4-day solo trip to collect water samples from a particularly remote area near Paioki, deep in the heart of the Everglades. I camped alone dozens of times before. The solitude never bothered me. Quite the opposite. I found peace in the chorus of frogs, the distant bellows of alligators, the whispering sawgrass. The Everglades at night has a pulse, a presence. It feels alive in a way that's difficult to articulate to someone who hasn't experienced it. The weather forecast predicted scattered thunderstorms throughout the week, typical for Florida in late summer. I wasn't concerned. My equipment was waterproof, and I had a solid one-person tent designed to withstand tropical conditions. Besides, the rain would provide perfect conditions for my research on water flow dynamics. The park ranger at the permit office raised an eyebrow when I pointed to my intended camping location on the map. Paioki? That's pretty isolated, especially this time of the year, she said, her pen hovering over my permit form. Not many people go out there since they closed the old observation platform. I know, I replied. That's why it's perfect. Minimal human interference with the water systems. She studied me for a moment. You've got satellite communication? I patted the emergency beacon attached to my pack and a weather radio. I'll be fine. She stamped my permit with a sigh. Make sure you check in when you return. If we don't hear from you by Sunday evening, we'll send someone out. I always do, I assured her. What I didn't tell her was that I was particularly excited about this trip because of the unusual reports I'd heard from other researchers. Several had mentioned anomalous water readings in that area, unexpected mineral content, strange pH variations, water temperatures that didn't match surrounding regions. Nothing alarming, just curious. The scientist in me couldn't resist investigating. The journey to my campsite took most of the day, a combination of airboat travel through the main waterways, followed by a long trek through sawgrass marshes and cypress domes. By late afternoon, I'd reached my destination, a small island of relatively dry ground surrounded by deeper water and dense vegetation, perfect for both camping and collecting samples from various water sources. I set up camp methodically, securing my tent on the highest ground available, arranging my research equipment under a tarp, and hanging my food supply from a sturdy cypress branch. Not just for bears, but to keep it away from the smaller, more persistent creatures that inhabit the swamp. The rain began just as I finished, a gentle patter on the broad leaves overhead. I welcomed it, settling under my tarp to organize my sampling vials and check my instruments. The forecast had mentioned the possibility of heavier storms later in the night, but nothing severe enough to cause concern. As darkness fell, the rain intensified. I retreated to my tent with my field journal, recording my initial observations by the light of my headlamp. The sound of raindrops on canvas usually lulled me to sleep on these expeditions, accompanying white noise that drowned out the occasional startling sounds of nocturnal wildlife. But that night, something about the rain felt different. There was a pattern to it that my brain couldn't quite decode. Almost like Morse code, but more complex. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 pause. It seemed to repeat, though not exactly. I found myself unintentionally tracking the pattern instead of focusing on my notes. You're anthropomorphizing natural phenomena. I chided myself aloud. It was a common trap for field researchers, assigning meaning to random environmental patterns. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rain was trying to tell me something. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I awoke with a start to a sound that definitely wasn't rain. A splashing, deliberate, rhythmic. Something large moving through the water surrounding my island. Alligator, I thought immediately. The Everglades was home to thousands of them. But alligators typically move through water with sinuous grace, barely creating a ripple. The splashing was different, more like footsteps, bipedal footsteps. I lay perfectly still listening. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, making the splashing sounds more distinct. They circled my island, maintaining a consistent distance, like something patrolling a perimeter, or perhaps assessing. My scientific mind began cataloging possibilities. A large wading bird? No, the pattern was too regular, too heavy. Another researcher? Highly unlikely in this remote location, especially at night. A poacher? Possible, but they generally avoided movement in darkness to prevent accidents. The splashing stopped directly in front of my tent, on the waterline about 20 feet away. I held my breath, ears straining in the sudden silence. Then came a sound that still haunts my dreams, a low, gurgling vocalization that was neither human nor animal. It reminded me of the sound water makes when forced through a narrow pipe, but with deliberate modulation, like speech, but not any language I'd ever heard. Something answered from the opposite side of my island, the same liquid, bubbling sounds. They were communicating, and there were at least two of them. Training and rationality warred with primal fear. I needed to see what was out there. Carefully, moving as silently as possible, I retrieved my powerful flashlight from beside my sleeping bag. My hand trembled slightly as I positioned myself near the tent flap, ready to unzip it just enough to shine the light toward the source of sounds. One quick look, I told myself. Identify the source, and the fear will diminish. Knowledge conquers fear. I unzipped the tent with agonizing slowness to minimize noise, created a small opening, and pointed my flashlight toward where I'd heard the first vocalization. With a deep breath, I switched it on. For a brief, blessed moment, I saw nothing but rain-dappled water and the twisted roots of cypress trees. Relief began to wash over me, until the beam caught movement. Something submerged, just below the surface, moving with purpose toward my light. What emerged from the water defies easy description. And even now, I question whether what I saw was real or some hallucination born of fear and isolation. But I'll try to describe it as clinically as possible, as the scientist I was trained to be. The figure rose slowly, water cascading from a form that approximated human shape, but was wrong in all its proportions. It stood perhaps 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that bent at too many joints. Its skin, if you could call it that, had the translucent quality of a creature that had evolved in darkness, revealing shadowy suggestions of internal structures that corresponded to no anatomy I recognized. But it was the face that broke my scientific detachment. There was just enough humanity in its features to trigger recognition, yet everything was distorted, as if human characteristics had been filtered through the evolutionary pressures of an aquatic environment for thousands of years. The eyes were too large, too widely spaced. The nose was merely 2 slits above a mouth that stretched too wide across the face. And when that mouth opened, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth, it emitted that same liquid, gurgling sound I'd heard before. It was looking directly at me, water streaming from its body, head tilted in what I can only describe as curiosity. My light didn't seem to bother it. In fact, it appeared to be examining the beam itself, one elongated hand reaching toward it with webbed fingers that stretched too far. The rational part of my brain shut down. I dropped the flashlight and scrambled backward, deeper into my tent, as if the thin nylon could provide any protection. Outside, I heard movement, splashing, those liquid vocalizations increasing in volume and frequency, a sense of excitement or agitation. They were coming closer. I grabbed my emergency beacon and pressed the activation button, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The small green light confirmed it was transmitting, but help would be hours away at best. I was on my own. Something brushed against the side of my tent. A deliberate touch that traveled along the fabric, like fingers tracing a path. I pressed myself against the opposite wall. Clutching my field knife in a white-knuckled grip, it would be useless against whatever was out there, but it was all I had. The touching stopped at the tent entrance. There was a moment of absolute stillness, broken only by the gentle patter of rain. Then, slowly, the zipper began to move upward, pulled by something outside. In that moment of pure terror, something unexpected happened. The rain suddenly intensified, changing from a drizzle to a torrential downpour in seconds. The sound was deafening on the tent canvas. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the world outside, casting the silhouette of my visitor against the tent wall. That elongated, wrong shape with too many angles. The thunder that followed was immediate and explosive. Directly overhead, the creatures outside responded with those liquid vocalizations. But now they sounded alarmed rather than curious. The zipper stopped moving. Another lightning strike, even closer. The splashing resumed, but moving away now, retreating into deeper water. Within moments, I could no longer hear them over the pounding rain. I remained frozen in place, knife still clutched in my hand, as the storm raged around me. It was no ordinary thunderstorm. The intensity and suddenness felt almost deliberate, as if the storm itself had intervened. I know how that sounds. But nothing about that night followed the rules of the natural world as I understood them. The storm continued for hours. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Dawn found me still pressed against the back of my tent, knife in hand, emergency beacon clutched to my chest. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by the normal sound of the Everglades awakening. Bird calls, the buzz of insects, distant splashes of ordinary wildlife. When I finally found the courage to unzip my tent and peer outside, everything appeared normal. The water levels had risen considerably from the rainfall, but otherwise, the scene was peaceful, bathed in golden morning light. There were no footprints, no evidence of my nighttime visitors. Nothing confirmed what I'd experienced was real. But I knew, deep in my bones, I knew I abandoned my research equipment, packed only the essentials, and made my way back toward the ranger station in record time. I reported that the storm had damaged my equipment, making it impossible to complete my work. I said nothing about what I'd seen. They would have thought me delusional from stress or isolation. Perhaps I was. I never returned to complete my PhD. How could I, when the foundation of my understanding of the natural world had been so profoundly shaken? I took a teaching position at a small community college instead, focusing on basic environmental science, staying far away from fieldwork. But I couldn't let it go entirely. In the years since, I researched obsessively, looking for any mention of similar encounters in the Everglades. Most are easily dismissed as folklore or misidentifications, but occasionally I find an account that rings with the same terrible authenticity as my own experience. Detailed description from lucid, credible witnesses of elongated figures emerging from the water during rainstorms. More disturbing are the historical accounts I've uncovered from early Spanish explorers who encountered an indigenous tribe living deep in the wetlands, a people they described as unnaturally tall and thin, who speak with the voices of water. The tribe apparently told the Spanish of the old ones who dwell beneath, entities they both worshipped and feared, who could only emerge when the sky waters meet the ground waters. During rainstorms, the scientific part of me, the part that still exists, has tried to formulate hypotheses. Perhaps they're an undiscovered species, a branch of human evolution that adapted to aquatic environments in isolation. Perhaps there's something else entirely, something that evolved in parallel to humanity but remained hidden in the depths of one of America's largest wetland ecosystems. Or perhaps, and this is a possibility that keeps me awake during rainstorms, perhaps they're not from our world at all. Perhaps the Everglades, with its unique properties as a vast, shallow river slowly flowing to the sea, creates conditions where the boundary between worlds thins during certain meteorological conditions. I've never gone camping again, in the Everglades or anywhere else. I avoid being out in the rain whenever possible, and on nights like tonight, when the rain drums steadily against my window, I find myself listening for patterns, for that liquid speech I heard only once but will never forget. Sometimes. And I know how this sounds. I think I can hear them calling to the raindrops, beckoning me to return to the water, to join them beneath the surface, where they dwell in darkness. Sometimes, in my weakest moments, I almost want to answer, "Are you listening to this in the rain? Turn it off. Turn it off now." Because once you start hearing the patterns in the raindrops, once you start understanding what they're saying, they'll know, and they'll come for you next. They're always looking for someone who can hear them through the water, someone who can help them come ashore for good. Don't be that person. Please, for your sake, and for everyone else's, just let the rain be rain. The sound of rain against glass always takes me back there, to that stretch of pristine shoreline on Florida's forgotten coast, where the Gulf of Mexico meets miles of undeveloped beach, where I learned that sometimes the tide brings more than just shells and driftwood. I've been planning the solo camping trip for months. After my mother's long illness and eventual passing, I needed space to grieve, to process, to breathe without well-meaning friends checking in on me constantly. Cape San Blas seemed perfect, remote enough to offer solitude, but with a small ranger station nearby for safety. The peninsula jutting into the Gulf of Mexico was known for its unspoiled beaches, spectacular sunsets, and excellent stargazing. Most importantly, it offered primitive beach camping, allowing visitors to pitch tents directly on the sand. I arrived in late September, just after the summer tourist season had ended, but before the snowbirds descended for winter. The ranger who processed my camping permit looked surprised to see a solo female camper. "Most folks don't come alone," he said, studying my driver's license. "Especially not this time of year." "I need the solitude," I replied simply. He nodded, seeming to understand. "Well, you'll have plenty of that. We've got a cold front coming through tomorrow night, so the other weekday campers canceled. You'll have the whole T section beach to yourself." He handed me a map, circling my designated area. "Just remember, no fires directly on the sand. Use the metal rings provided, and watch the tide. It comes in fast along this stretch." As he handed me my permit, he hesitated. "One more thing. If you see anything unusual, anything that makes you uncomfortable, don't investigate. Just come straight back to the station." I raised an eyebrow. "Unusual like what?" "Wildlife." "Sure, wildlife," he agreed too quickly. "Boars come down to beach sometimes. And there've been some, unusual debris washing up lately. Just hurricane aftermath from down south, but better safe than sorry." I was certain he wasn't telling me everything, but I didn't press the issue. Whatever local concerns he had, drug smuggling maybe, or endangered turtle nests, I had no intention of causing trouble. I thanked him and headed to my designated camping area. The beach was even more beautiful than the photos I'd seen. Pristine white sand stretched for miles, bordered by sea oats and low dunes on one side, and the clear turquoise waters of the Gulf on the other. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over everything. In the distance, a pod of dolphins arced through the waves, their fins momentarily visible before disappearing. I found my designated site, a small clearing among the dunes with a metal fire ring, and set up camp. My tent faced the water, allowing me to leave the rain fly off and now and stargaze through the mesh ceiling later. I arranged my cooking gear, secure my food in the hard-sided cooler as recommended. Apparently raccoons were clever and persistent here, and settled in to watch the sunset. The shoreline directly in front of my campsite curved slightly, creating a small, secluded cove as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and pinks. I noticed something unusual about this particular stretch of beach. The incoming tide seemed to behave differently here, rather than approaching in regular waves. The water moved in strange, almost circular patterns, creating eddies and whirlpools where there should have been none. Curious, I walked down to the water's edge. The sand felt unusually firm beneath my feet, almost like walking on compacted clay rather than loose grains. At the titterline, the water swirled around my ankles in distinct patterns, clockwise, then counterclockwise, then forming perfect concentric circles. This wasn't normal tidal behavior, not even accounting for the curved shoreline. I knelt to examine the sand where water met land, mixing with the usual tiny shells and bits of coral, or fragments of something else, something that gleamed with iridescence that didn't look natural. I picked up one piece, about the size of my thumbnail. It resembled mother of pearl but shifted colors as I turned it, from deep blue to purple to a green, so dark it was almost black. "What are you?" I murmured, pocketing the fragment. Perhaps the ranger station had information about local minerals or shells I wasn't familiar with. The sun completed its descent, and twilight settled over the beach. I returned to my campsite, started a small fire in the designated ring, and prepared a simple dinner. The night was clear and still, surprisingly cool for Florida in September, the approaching cold front making itself felt already. After dinner, I extinguished the fire properly and retreated to my tent, leaving the rain fly off to enjoy the spectacular canopy of stars overhead. I must have dozed off while stargazing, because I woke suddenly several hours later. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. The night remained quiet except for the gentle sound of waves. Then I noticed a light, a soft, pulsing glow coming from the direction of the water, visible through the mesh walls of my tent. My first thought was bioluminescence. I'd read that certain algae blooms could create glowing blue waves. Eager to see this natural phenomenon, I slipped on my shoes and jacket and stepped outside. What I saw wasn't algae. The tide had come in significantly, reaching almost the first line of dunes. But instead of the dark expanse of nighttime ocean I expected, a pattern of lights undulated beneath the surface, not the blue of typical bioluminescence, but shifting colors that matched the strange fragment I found earlier. Deep purples, blues, and greens pulsed in mesmerizing patterns, illuminating the water from below. More disturbing were the shapes moving within those lights. Vague humanoid forms that seemed to sway and dance in the underwater glow. They were too far out and too indistinct to make out clearly, but something about their proportions seemed wrong. Arms too long, heads too large. I stood frozen at the edge of my campsite, torn between fascination and growing unease. This was clearly what the ranger had obliquely warned me about. The sensible thing would be to retreat to my tent, wait until morning, and report what I'd seen. But the lights were hypnotic. The patterns they made increasingly complex and beautiful. Without fully intending to, I found myself walking toward the water, The sound of the waves seemed to resolve into something almost like music, a haunting melody just below the threshold of clear hearing. It reminded me, strangely, of the lullabies my mother used to sing when I was small. The same mother I just lost, whose absence had driven me to this solitary beach. I'd reached the water's edge before I became fully aware of moving. The glowing shapes were closer now, their dance more intricate. I could almost make out features on the humanoid forms. Suggestions of eyes that reflected the same iridescence as the light surrounding them. Elongated limbs that moved with liquid grace. One figure separated from the others, approaching the shallows. As it drew nearer, I could see it more clearly, a form that resembled a woman, but with proportions that weren't quite human. Her skin had the same iridescent quality as the fragment I'd found, shifting colors with each movement. Where hair should be, tendrils that might have been plant-like or might have been living tissue undulated around a face that was both beautiful and alien. She stopped at the point where deeper water met the shallows, extending one too long arm toward me in what seemed like invitation. Her mouth moved, and though I couldn't possibly have heard words underwater from that distance, I somehow understood. "Join us," she seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you." Something warm trickled down my cheek. I was crying, though I didn't know why. The grief I'd been carrying since my mother's death seemed to well up and overflow, and somehow, irrationally, I felt that this creature understood my pain in a way no human could. I took a step forward, my shoes sinking into the wet sand. Then another. The water reached my ankles, cool but not unpleasant. The creature's expression, if it could be called that, seemed to radiate approval. More of the glowing figures approached the shallows, forming a loose semicircle behind the first. They all extended their arms in similar welcoming gestures. "You belong with us," their movements seemed to say. "Your sorrow will end here." I took another step, the water now at my calves. It should have been freezing in the night air, but instead felt soothingly warm, almost like bath water. The fragment in my pocket seemed to pulse in time with the lights in the water, growing warmer against my thigh. The lead figure moved closer, now only about 20 feet away. Details of her face became clearer, eyes that were too large and entirely black, save for pinpricks of light that matched the swirling colors around her. A mouth that stretched wider than possible on a human face, revealing teeth that resembled polished abalone shells. She was beautiful and terrifying, and I couldn't look away. The water reached my knees now, soaking my pants. The rational part of my brain tried to sound warnings about riptides, about hypothermia, about the strangeness of it all. But those thoughts seemed distant and unimportant compared to the promise of belonging that the creatures offered. "Your mother is here." The leader seemed to communicate, though no words were actually spoken. All who are lost find their way to us eventually. At the mention of my mother, a sob escaped me. "Mom," I whispered, taking another step forward. The water reached mid-thigh now, and I could feel the pull of the current, gentle but insistent, drawing me further out. The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. She's waiting, just a little further. Something about that smile, too wide, too many teeth, triggered a moment of clarity. My mother had been cremated. I'd scattered her ashes in her favorite garden. Whatever these things were, they were lying, using my grief as bait. I took a step backward, fighting against a current which suddenly seemed much stronger. "No," I said aloud. "You're not real. This isn't real." The creature's expression shifted, the beautiful features contorting into something predatory. The others behind her began moving more agitatedly, the gentle dance becoming a frenzied swirl. The lights pulsed faster, their colors shifting to deeper blues and purples. "You are already ours," the leader communicated, her thought voice no longer gentle but sharp with command. "The tide has marked you." I looked down and gasped. The water around my legs had begun to change, taking on the same iridescent quality as the creatures. Worse, my skin where the water touched seemed to be absorbing that iridescence. Tiny patches of shifting color appearing beneath the surface of my flesh. Terror finally broke through the hypnotic spell. I turned and began to wade towards shore, fighting against the current which had become a powerful pull. The water seemed thicker somehow, more resistant, as if deliberately trying to impede my progress. Behind me, the light display had become frantic, casting wild shadows across the beach. The melody in the waves had transformed into a harsh, discordant keen that hurt my ears. I could feel the creatures' rage, their hunger, their determination not to lose what they had considered already claimed. Something brushed against my leg underwater, a touch so cold it burned. I cried out, struggling forward with renewed desperation. The shore seemed impossibly far away, though logically I knew I'd only been in water up to my thighs. Another touch, this time against my back. A clear push trying to force me deeper. I stumbled, but managed to keep my footing on the increasingly unstable sand. The fragment in my pocket had become painfully hot, burning through the fabric. I reached in and flung it away from me, back toward the deeper water. The moment the fragment left my hand, several things happened at once. A piercing cry rose from the water behind me, filled with fury and what sounded strangely like grief. The current pulling at my legs suddenly released, and most unexpectedly, rain began to fall, heavy drops that hadn't been forecast until following evening. I staggered the remaining distance to shore, collapsing onto the dry sand beyond the tidal line. Behind me, the glowing display in the water became chaotic, the lights and shapes retreating rapidly into deeper water. Within minutes, the Gulf returned to its normal nighttime appearance, dark water reflecting the partially clouded sky, ordinary waves breaking on the shore. The rain intensified, soaking my already wet clothes, but I barely noticed. I was fixated on my legs, examining them for any trace of the iridescent patches I'd seen. In the dim light, my skin appeared normal, though my legs burned as if I'd waded through jellyfish tentacles rather than water. I don't remember the trip back to my campsite. Somehow I found myself inside my tent, hurriedly securing the rain fly with shaking hands as the storm intensified. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the beach in stark flashes. Through the tent wall, I could see the water, now whipped into fierce wave by the wind. No lights moved beneath the surface. Whatever had been there, or whatever I had hallucinated, was gone, but the burning sensation in my legs remained, and when I finally gathered the courage to examine them by the light of my camping lantern, I found something that made my blood run cold. A pattern of tiny, perfect circles marked my skin from ankle to mid-thigh, circles that shifted with an iridescent sheen when the light hit them at certain angles. I spent the remainder of that terrible night huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm rage and wondering if I was losing my mind. By dawn, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and I convinced myself that stress and grief had triggered some sort of episode. The circular marks on my legs must be an allergic reaction to something in the water, unusual jellyfish, perhaps, or some chemical contaminant. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my campsite, struggling with the rain-soaked tent. My only thought was to get back to the ranger station, report what I'd seen or some sanitized version of it, and get medical attention for my legs, which now itched unbearably in addition to burning. The ranger station was closed when I arrived, not scheduled to open for another hour. Unwilling to wait, I left a note saying I'd had to leave early due to the unexpected storm, then drove straight to the nearest urgent care clinic in Port St. Joe. The physician's assistant who examined me seemed puzzled by the marks. "Never seen anything quite like this," she admitted, peering at my legs. "Almost looks like sucker marks from octopus tentacles, but the pattern is too regular, almost geometric." She prescribed a steroid cream for the inflammation and suggested I follow up with a dermatologist if the marks didn't fade within a week. I thanked her and left, stopping at a local cafe with Wi-Fi to research what I'd experienced. I found nothing about glowing creatures in the Gulf of Mexico, nothing about iridescent skin reactions from swimming at Cape San Blas. But I did find a few intriguing references in local folklore to the night dancers of Forgotten Coast, entities said to lure the grief-stricken into the water during new moons. According to these obscure legends, the creatures were neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply different, beings from the depths who occasionally sought to add to their numbers by calling to those whose sorrow made them susceptible. The accounts were frustratingly vague about what happened to those who joined the dancers, but the implications were unsettling. More concrete was a news article from 1962 about a cluster of disappearances along Cape San Blas. 5 people over the course of 3 months, all of whom had recently experienced significant losses. The beaches have been temporarily closed. The disappearances eventually attributed to strong rip tides and warning signs installed. I drove home that day, unable to face another night on the peninsula. The circular marks on my legs faded over the next week, just as the PA had predicted. But sometimes when I shower or swim, they reappear briefly. Iridescent circles that shift from blue to purple to green when the water touches them. And always there's a pull, a gentle but persistent urge to return to Cape San Blas, to wade into that specific cove where the tide behaves strangely. The feeling is strongest during the new moon and almost unbearable when it rains, as if the raindrops carry messages, reminders of a promise I made and broke. I haven't gone back. Not yet, but I've found myself researching properties in the area, looking at small cottages with direct beach access. I tell myself it's because I fell in love with the natural beauty of Forgotten Coast. But deep down, I know it's because they're still calling me. They're patient, the night dancers. They have existed in those waters since before humans walked the Florida coastline. They can wait for me to accept what I already know. That part of me belongs to them now, marked by the tide and bound by whatever ancient magic or science allows them to exist. Sometimes at night, especially when it rains, I swear I can hear their melody again. That haunting, beautiful music that sounds almost like my mother's lullabies. I find myself standing at my window, watching the raindrops illuminated by streetlights, seeing patterns in them that shouldn't be there. Patterns that match the circles on my legs. Are you listening to this in the rain? Look carefully at the droplets on your window. Do they move the way rain should move? Or do they form circles, spirals, patterns that seem almost deliberate? Be careful near the water when you're hurting. Grief opens doorways within us. Doorways that some things know how to use. And once you're marked by the tide, you're never truly free of its pull. I know this now. Sooner or later, I'll return to Cape San Blas, to that secluded cove where the tide moves in impossible patterns. And next time, I don't think I'll have the strength to turn back. After all, maybe they weren't lying. Maybe, in some strange way, all who are lost do find their way to them eventually. Maybe my mother is waiting beneath those iridescent waves. Are you there? If you are, you have a lot of courage. To make sure you didn't fall asleep, comment now with the word Unbelievable. That way, I'll know you were there until that part of the video. Do you hear that rain tapping on your window? I used to love that sound. Now it fills me with dread. I grew up in Florida, you see, not the Florida of theme parks and beaches that tourists flock to, but the older, stranger Florida. The Florida of ancient Spanish forts and crumbling lighthouses. The Florida where history seems to seep into the very air, where the past refuses to stay buried. This happened 3 summers ago, when I was working as a park ranger at St. Augustine. I'd been assigned to the old lighthouse camping area, a small, secluded spot about a mile from the historic lighthouse itself. It was a temporary position, just for the season, but I loved it. The campground was quiet, rarely at full capacity, frequented mostly by history buffs and the occasional paranormal enthusiast drawn by the lighthouse's reputation for being haunted. I didn't believe in ghosts then. I was too practical, too grounded in reality. The stories amused me. Tales of the lighthouse keeper's daughters who drowned in the 1870s, of phantom footsteps in the spiral staircase, of lights moving in the tower when no one was there. Tourist fodder. I thought, nothing more. The night it happened was meant to be my night off. I planned to drive into town, have dinner at my favorite seafood place, maybe catch a film. But the sky had been threatening rain all day, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, and sure enough, by late afternoon, the downpour began. Not just any rain, but one of those relentless Florida summer storms that turns the world gray and makes driving a hazard. My colleague Mark called around 5. Listen, mate, I hate to ask, but my car's in the shop, and with this weather, I can't get to campground for the overnight shift. Any chance you could cover? It's dead quiet anyway. We've only got one tent set up, some professor doing research on a lighthouse. I glanced out at the sheets of rain hammering down inside. Yeah, all right. Not like I can do much else in this weather anyway. You're a lifesaver, Mark said, relief evident in his voice. Just the usual rounds. The professor's been there 3 days already, keeps to himself. Probably won't even notice you're there. I arrived at the ranger station just as dusk was falling, the rain still pounding steadily. The small parking area was empty except for an aging Volvo with university parking permits plastered across its bumper. The professor's car, presumably. The ranger station was really just a small cabin with an office area, a kitchenette, and a bunk room for overnight shifts. I made myself a cup of tea and checked the logbook. Mark's notes were sparse. One camper, Dr. William Thorne, Site 3, studying lighthouse history, staying through weekend. I waited until the rain eased slightly before donning my waterproofs and heading out for my first patrol. The campground was small, just 5 cleared areas set in a semicircle facing the ocean, each with a fire pit and picnic table. Only Site 3 showed signs of occupation. A blue tent set up beneath the partial shelter of a scrubby pine, a tarp creating an additional covered area where research materials were spread across the picnic table, protected from the rain. I approached, calling out to announce my presence. Evening, park ranger checking in. Everything all right out here? For a moment, there was no response, and I wondered if Dr. Thorne had abandoned his camp for more comfortable lodgings in town. Then the tent zipper opened, and a man emerged, hunched against the rain. He was older than I'd expected, perhaps in his early 70s, with a shock of white hair and intense blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Despite the humid heat, he wore a cable-knit sweater that had seen better days. "Ah, you're not Mark," he said, voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "No, sir. I'm covering tonight. Just making sure you're managing all right in this weather." Dr. Thorne glanced toward the ocean, barely visible through the curtain of rain. "Oh, yes. This is nothing. You should see the storms in my homeland." He gestured to his setup. "I've weathered worse." I nodded. noticing how meticulously organized his research area was. Notebooks stacked neatly, reference materials protected in plastic sleeves, an ancient-looking leather-bound journal placed carefully at the center of it all. Researching the lighthouse? I asked, making conversation. Something flickered across his face. Caution, perhaps in a manner of speaking. I'm more interested in the keeper, Jonathan Ellis. The name wasn't familiar to me. Not one of the famous ones. And I know about the daughters who drowned. But no, Dr. Thorne interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. Ellis came later, early 1900s. He's largely forgotten now, which is unfortunate. He made significant contributions to our understanding of coastal illumination techniques. There was something odd about the way he emphasized the word unfortunate, but I chalked it up to academic passion for an obscure historical figure. Well, if you need anything, I'll be at the station all night. The storm's supposed to get worse before it gets better. Dr. Thorne's gaze shifted to the lighthouse in the distance. Its beam now visible as a faint glow through the rain and gathering darkness. Yes, I expect it will. His voice had taken on an almost reverent quality. Tonight marks the anniversary, you see. Anniversary of Ellis's disappearance. He turned those intense blue eyes back to me. 120 years ago tonight, he vanished from the lighthouse during a storm very much like this one. They found the light still burning. His logbook opened his final entry, but no trace of the man himself. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. Well, that's interesting. Good luck with your research, Dr. Thorne. He nodded, already turning back to his tent. Indeed, good night, Ranger. I continued my patrol, but there was little to see. The rain had intensified again, driving in from the ocean in wind-whipped sheets. I made my way back to the station, soaked despite my waterproofs, looking forward to dry clothes and another hot cup of tea. The evening passed slowly. I checked in with park headquarters, completed some paperwork, and tried to focus on a dog-eared paperback I found in the station's small collection. But my thoughts kept returning to Dr. Thorne and his research. Something about our interaction had left me unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Around midnight, I decided to make another patrol. The storm had reached its peak, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the eaves of the small station. Part of me wanted to stay in the warm, dry cabin, but duty called. Besides, I wanted to check that Dr. Thorne's tent hadn't blown away in the gale. The moment I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The beam from the lighthouse, which should have been sweeping regularly across the darkened landscape, was stationary, pointing out to sea. That wasn't right. The lighthouse was automated now, its mechanism designed to rotate continuously. I radioed headquarters immediately. This is Ranger Collins at St. Augustine Lighthouse Campground. The lighthouse beam appears to be malfunctioning. Static crackled before response came through. Copy that, Collins. We'll alert maintenance. But they won't be able to get out there until morning with this weather. No ships expected along that passage tonight anyway. So it's not an emergency. Roger that. I replied, but something made me add, I'm going to check on our camper. Then I might walk over to the lighthouse, just to take a look from the outside. Negative, Collins. Stay put in this weather. The lighthouse is secured, and the system has redundancies. Maintenance will handle it tomorrow. Copy that, I said, but I'd already decided, after checking on Dr. Thorne's campsite, I would at least walk to where I could get a better view of the lighthouse. I made my way through the storm to Site 3, the beam of my torch cutting through the darkness. When I reached the clearing, I stopped short. The tent was still there, but the research materials were gone from the table. The tarp had collapsed on one side, water pooling in its center. Dr. Thorne? I called, my voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Dr. Thor, are you there? No response. I approached the tent and called again, louder this time. When there was still no answer, I unzipped the entrance and shone my torch inside. Empty. The sleeping bag was there, neatly laid out, but there was no sign of Dr. Thorne or his research materials. Only that leather-bound journal remained, placed deliberately in the center of the sleeping bag. A sense of foreboding washed over me. Where would he go in this weather? The obvious answer loomed in my mind, its beam still shining steadily out to sea rather than rotating as it should. The lighthouse. I should have called headquarters again, reported the missing camper. That would have been protocol. Instead, I took the journal. To return to him, I told myself, zipped up his tent, and set off toward the lighthouse. The path was treacherous in storm, mud slicking beneath my boots, rain driving into my face with such force that I could barely see where I was going. The journey, normally a pleasant 15-minute walk, took nearly 3 times as long. By the time the lighthouse loomed before me, I was exhausted and questioning my decision. The lighthouse stood tall against a stormy sky, its beam still fixed, pointing out to sea like an accusing finger. The keeper's house beside it, now a museum, was dark as expected. But the lighthouse itself, there was a warm glow coming from the windows at its base, the kind that could only come from lamplight, not electric bulbs. I approached cautiously, aware of how strange this was. The lighthouse was fully automated now, had been for decades. There was no need for anyone to be inside, especially not at this hour, in this weather. The entrance door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I pushed it open further, calling out as I did so, "Hello? Park ranger here. Dr. Thor, are you inside?" The interior was transformed. Instead of the museum-like display of preserved history I expected, the ground floor looked lived in, functional, as it might have appeared a century ago. A small fire crackled in the stove that I knew for a fact had been decommissioned in the 1940s. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over simple furnishings. The air smelled of wood smoke, lamp oil, and salt. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. "Ah, there you are." The voice came from behind me, making me jump. I spun around to find Dr. Thorne, though he looked somehow different. His posture straighter, his eyes brighter, his entire demeanor more vigorous despite his sodden clothes. "I was hoping you'd come. I left a journal for you to find." "What's going on here?" I demanded, gesturing at the impossible scene before us. "What is all this?" History repeating itself, Dr. Thorne said simply, or rather, correcting itself. He moved past me into the room, setting down the box of research materials he'd been carrying. "Do you know what happened to Jonathan Ellis?" I swallowed hard. "You said he disappeared." "Yes, but I didn't tell you why." He began unpacking his materials, handling each item with reverence. Ellis was brilliant, you see. He had theories about lighthouse operation that were decades ahead of his time. But more than that, he believed lighthouses stood at the threshold between the worlds, that with the right configuration of lenses, at the right moment, during the right atmospheric conditions, a lighthouse beam could open a doorway. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. A doorway to where? Dr. Thorne smiled, a sad, knowing expression. To when, not where. Ellis wasn't trying to reach another place, but another time. And on a night exactly like this, 120 years ago, he succeeded. The problem was, no one believed his research was possible. After he vanished, they dismantled his modifications to the lens system, destroyed his notes, wrote him off as another keeper who had been driven mad by isolation. He turned to face me fully. Except his journal survived, passed down through generations of my family. Because Jonathan Ellis was my great-grandfather. My mouth went dry. That's not possible. You have to be much older than I appear. Dr. Thorne or Ellis laughed softly. Time behaves differently where I've been, but I've spent decades searching for a way back, waiting for just the right conditions to return to this night, to finish what I started. I clutched the journal tightly, finally understanding why he'd left it for me to find. You're not Dr. William Thorne at all, are you? Thorne was my mother's maiden name. I needed credentials that would grant me access, but no, my name is Jonathan Ellis. He gestured upward, toward the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. And tonight, I'm going to correct a mistake I made a century ago. I should have run. I should have called for help. Instead, I heard myself asking, what mistake? Ellis's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. I set the alignment incorrectly. I opened a doorway, yes, but not to what I intended. I've spent what felt like lifetimes trying to get back here, to this specific night, because tonight, he glanced at an old pocket watch he withdrawn from the sweater. In exactly 22 minutes, the convergence will occur again. The storm, the tide, the celestial alignment. Everything necessary to open the doorway properly. And then what happens? His smile was both serene and frightening. Then I can go where I truly belong. And anyone with me, I took an involuntary step backward. I should report this. Whatever you're doing, it's not authorized. Who would believe you? Ellis asked gently. Look outside. I turned and opened the door again, where there should have been a modern park grounds. There was only wild coastline, battered by the storm. The landscape as it might have appeared a century ago. It's already starting, Ellis said. The transition. It happens gradually at first, then all at once. That's why I needed to go to the top early, to make the final adjustments. He gestured to the spiral staircase. Would you care to join me? To witness history, or perhaps to make it? Every instinct screamed at me to flee. But where would I go? Outside was when, what? And some traitorous part of me, some curiosity I couldn't suppress, wanted to see what would happen next. I'll come, I said, but just to observe. Ellis nodded, seemingly satisfied. Bring the journal. You may want to document what you witness. We ascended the spiral staircase in silence, our footsteps echoing against the iron steps. As we climbed higher, the sound of the storm intensified, wind howling around the tower with increasing fury. The lighthouse seemed to sway slightly, though I knew its construction should prevent such movement. The lantern room at the top was transformed just as the ground floor had been, the modern automated system replaced by the original prismatic lens, massive and complex. Ellis moved around it with the familiarity of long practice, making minute adjustments, checking angles against calculations in a notebook he produced from his pocket. Almost ready, he murmured, more to himself than to me. Almost time. Outside, through the glass panels of the lantern room, I could see the storm reaching its peak. But there was something wrong with the rain. It wasn't falling naturally. In places it seemed to hang suspended in the air. In others it fell upward, defying gravity. The ocean beyond was a churning mass of temporal distortion. Waves freezing mid-crash before dissolving into mist. What's happening out there? I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. Time is becoming fluid. Ellis replied without looking up from his work. The barriers are thinning. When the moment comes, I'll direct the beam precisely and the doorway will open. He checked his pocket watch again. 7 minutes. I opened the journal, needing something tangible to hold on to in this increasingly surreal situation. The pages were filled with dense technical writing, diagrams of lens configurations, astronomical calculations, and, towards the end, increasingly desperate entries about failed attempts, about being trapped in a place between times. The final entry, dated the very night Ellis had disappeared a century ago, simply read, I made a mistake. God help me. I've opened the wrong door. What came through I asked, looking up from the journal, when you opened the wrong door, what came through it? Ellis paused in his adjustments, his expression darkening. Some doors should remain closed. Some thresholds should not be crossed in either direction. He returned to his work with increased urgency. That mistake will be undone tonight. A sudden, violent gust of wind struck the lighthouse, making the entire structure shudder. One of the glass panels in the lantern room cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. Through the damaged glass, I could see something impossible. The rain outside had stopped moving entirely, suspended in the air like millions of tiny diamonds. "It's time," Ellis said, moving to the control mechanism for the lens. "Stand back." I pressed myself against the wall as he made his final adjustment. The beam, which had been pointing steadily out to sea, suddenly intensified, its light no longer white but shifting through colors I had no names for. Where it touched the suspended raindrops, they began to transform, crystallizing into a structure, a doorway of light and water hanging impossibly in the air outside the lighthouse. Ellis looked back at me, his face illuminated by that unearthly light. For a moment, he appeared as he truly was, an old, old man, worn by time and hardship, his eyes haunted by things no human should have seen. "Last chance," he said. "You can come with me." "Where?" I managed to ask. "Where does it lead?" His smile was enigmatic. "To the beginning, or perhaps the end, to where the lost things go." He turned toward the broken glass panel, which had shattered further, creating an opening large enough for a person to step through. "Thank you for bringing the journal. Its journey is complete now." Before I could respond, before I could try to stop him, Ellis stepped through the broken panel. Not falling, as he should have, but walking into the suspended rain, into that doorway of light. For one brief moment, I saw him turn back, his expression one of perfect peace. Then the doorway collapsed in on itself, taking him with it. The beam from the lighthouse returned to normal, resuming its automated rotation as if nothing had happened. Outside, the rain began to fall naturally again, the storm already beginning to abate. I stood alone in the lantern room, clutching the journal that Ellis had left behind. No, not left behind, I realized. Given to me deliberately. I opened again, turning to that final page, and found that beneath the last entry, words were appearing on the page as if written by an invisible hand. "The cycle is broken. The door is closed. Keep watch, lighthouse keeper." I don't work at St. Augustine anymore. I couldn't after what happened. The official report stated that the lighthouse experienced a power fluctuation during the storm, and that Dr. William Thorne, visiting scholar, had unfortunately been swept out to sea while unwisely exploring the coastal area in dangerous conditions. His body was never recovered. I kept the journal. I read it cover to cover dozens of times, trying to understand what I witnessed that night, trying to understand my role in Ellis's plan. Because I'm certain now that nothing was accidental. Not my presence that night, not Mark's sudden inability to make a shift, not the malfunction of the lighthouse beam that drew me there. Ellis needed a witness. He needed someone to remember, to understand what had happened, to keep the door closed. I live in a small cottage now, far from Florida, far from any coast. But I've filled my house with barometers and weather instruments. I track storms obsessively, and whenever it rains at night, I sit by my window, watching the droplets for any sign of suspension, any hint that time might be becoming fluid again. Because whatever came through when Ellis opened the wrong door a century ago, whatever he spent lifetimes trying to undo, I fear it might not be gone entirely. I fear it might be patient, waiting for another lighthouse, another keeper, another storm. So I keep watch, and I keep the journal close. Are you listening to this in the rain? Look closely at the droplets on your window. Are they falling naturally? Are you absolutely certain? Because sometimes when the conditions are just right, when a storm rages and a light shines at precisely the correct angle, sometimes the rain remembers how to open doors. I need you to understand something before I begin. I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. What happened to me in the Ocala National Forest was real, and I've spent every day since then trying to convince myself otherwise. But I can't. Not anymore. Not with the rain tapping at my window like skeletal fingers, reminding me of that night. I was driving back to Jacksonville from a conference in Tampa. It was late October, that brief window when Florida pretends to have autumn. I decided to take the scenic route through Central Florida rather than the monotonous interstate. A small adventure, I thought, just me, my car, and the open road cutting to one of the largest national forests in the eastern United States. The Ocala National Forest spans nearly 400,000 acres of dense pine woods, scrub, and crystal clear springs. Beautiful during the day, but as the sun began to set and storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the beauty transformed into something more primeval. The towering pines became silhouettes against the darkening sky, their needles whispering secrets in the rising wind. I should have turned back when I saw the first lightning strike in the distance. I should have found a motel in Ocala or Silver Springs, but I was only a few hours from home, and I've always been stubborn. Just a summer storm, I told myself as the first fat raindrops began to splatter against my windscreen. It'll pass quickly. Florida, weather has a way of proving you wrong. Within minutes, the rain was coming down in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of my car. I slowed to a crawl, hunched forward over the steering wheel, squinting to make out the winding forest road. The headlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness and rain, barely illuminating anything. That's when my car stuttered. Just once at first, a momentary hesitation that sent a spike of anxiety through my chest. Then again, longer this time, the engine coughing like something was caught in its throat. No, I muttered, patting the dashboard as if encouragement might help. Not here. Not now. 5 years with that reliable Honda. Never a single problem. Until that night, of course. The car died completely just as I rounded a bend in the road, rolling to a stop at what appeared to be a small pull-off area. I tried the ignition again, nothing but an anemic click. I checked my mobile, no signal. Not surprising in the depths of the forest. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain hammering on the roof, weighing my options. I could wait until morning and hope someone drove by. I could try to walk to the nearest ranger station or campground, though I had no idea how far that might be. Or I could spend an uncomfortable night in my car and deal with it in daylight. The decision was made for me when I noticed lights through the trees, not far off the road, perhaps a few hundred yards into the forest. Warm, yellow lights that suggested a cabin or ranger outpost. Salvation. I grabbed my raincoat from the back seat, stuffed my mobile and wallet into its pockets, and steeled myself for a dash through the downpour. The moment I opened the car door, the storm assaulted me. Wind-driven rain that seemed to come from all directions at once pelted my face with stinging droplets. I pulled up my hood and set off toward the lights, using my phone's torch to find a path through the underbrush. The ground was already saturated, my shoes sinking into mud with each step. Branches clawed at my coat, as if trying to hold me back. But the lights grew closer, and soon I could make out a small, rustic cabin nestled among the pines. Smoke curled from its chimney despite the rain, promising warmth and shelter. I approached the wooden door, suddenly aware how strange this might seem. A drenched stranger appearing out of the storm in the middle of nowhere. But desperation overruled social awkwardness. I knocked firmly. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from inside. The door opened a crack, and a weathered face peered out at me. An older man, perhaps in his 70s, with a silver beard and eyes the pale blue of winter sky. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. I nodded, rain dripping from my hood. "Broke down just down the road. I saw your lights." He studied me for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Better come in before you drown." The cabin's interior was bathed in the warm glow of kerosene lamps and a modest fire crackling in a stone hearth. It was a single-room dwelling, rustic but neat. A small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a worn leather armchair near the fire. Hunting and fishing equipment hung from the walls, alongside what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of the forest. "Thank you," I said, standing awkwardly on the welcome mat, conscious of the puddle forming around my feet. "I don't mean to intrude. I just need to get out of the storm and maybe use a phone." "No phone here," the man said, moving to the fire to stoke it. "Never needed one. Name's Henry." "James," I replied. "James Mitchell. I was driving back to Jacksonville when my car died." Henry nodded, unsurprised. This stretch of road has that effect sometimes, especially on nights like this. He gestured to a small rack near the door. "Hang your coat there. Got some coffee on the stove if you want to warm up." I removed my dripping coat and accepted the offered mug of coffee gratefully. Sinking into the chair he indicated by the fire, the warmth began to seep back into my limbs, and with it, a sense of relief. Yes, I was stranded, but at least I found shelter and a seemingly hospitable host. "You live out here permanently?" I asked, making conversation. Henry settled into the armchair across from me, long enough that it feels that way. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach those pale eyes. "I'm a caretaker of sorts." "For the Forest Service?" He took a sip of his own coffee. "Something like that." Thunder cracked directly overhead, making me flinch. The rain intensified, if that was even possible. A deafening roar on the cabin's metal roof. "Nasty night," Henry commented, looking toward a single window where water streamed down the glass like a waterfall. "Reminds me of another storm, years back. Had a visitor, then another stranded driver." Henry's expression grew distant. "Lost hikers. Young couple who strayed from the trail." He shook his head. "They never should have been out in that part of the forest to begin with. Some areas aren't meant for visitors." Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to the spooky setting and my frayed nerves. "Well, I appreciate you taking me in. Once the storm passes, or in the morning, I can try to find a ranger station." "Morning would be best," Henry said firmly. "No point trying to navigate these woods at night, especially not in this weather." He rose and moved to a small cupboard, retrieving a bottle of amber liquid and 2 small glasses. "Care for something stronger than coffee?" I nodded, and he poured a finger of whiskey into each glass, handing one to me before returning to his seat. The liquor burned pleasantly going down, a counterpoint to the chill that had seeped into my bones. "So," Henry said after a comfortable silence, "what brings you through Ocala instead of taking the highway like most folks?" "Wanted a change of scenery," I replied. "I've driven I-75 too many times. Thought the forest route would be more interesting." Henry chuckled, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "Well, you certainly got your wish." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, James, did you notice anything unusual before your car broke down?" The question caught me off guard. "Unusual? Like what?" "Oh, anything out of the ordinary. Animals acting strangely, lights in the woods, sounds that didn't belong." I thought back, trying to separate my anxiety from actual observations. "I don't think so. Just a storm coming in." Then I remembered something. Actually, there was one thing. The radio, it kept cutting out, then coming back on a different station. Old music, like from the 1940s or 50s. Then static, then nothing at all. Henry nodded slowly, as if I confirmed something he already knew. This stretch of forest has peculiarities, especially during storms. He took another sip of whiskey. The locals call this road the Nowhere Road. Say if you drive it during certain conditions, you might end up somewhere else entirely for a while. I smiled politely, assuming this was local folklore he shared with all tourists. Like the Bermuda Triangle of Central Florida? Something like that. Henry agreed, not returning my smile. Except what gets lost here sometimes finds its way back. Changed. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin's shutters, making us both look toward the window. For a split second, I thought I saw a face press against the glass, pale, with hollow eye sockets. But it was gone so quickly I dismissed it as a trick of the rain and darkness. "Listen," Henry said, his voice lower now. "I need to check on something outside. Will you be all right here for a few minutes?" "In this weather?" I asked incredulously. He stood, reaching for a heavy oilskin coat hanging by the door, just to shed out back. "Won't be long." He pulled on the coat and a wide-brimmed hat. "One thing, though, while I'm gone, no matter what you hear, don't open the door. Not until you hear me call your name 3 times. Understood. The seriousness in his voice made me nod without question, though a sense of unease began to grow in my stomach. This was becoming uncomfortably like the setup to every horror story I'd ever heard. 3 times, he repeated, then slipped out the door into the howling storm. Alone in the cabin, I suddenly noticed how many shadows the kerosene lamps cast, long, shifting shapes that seemed to ride with a life of their own as the flames flickered. The comfortable warmth of moments ago gave way to a prickling awareness of my isolation. I poured myself another small measure of whiskey, needing its false courage. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the ancient clock on the mantelpiece. 5 minutes. 10. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be centered directly over the cabin. Lightning strikes coming one after another. Thunder so loud it shook the foundations. At 15 minutes, I began to worry about Henry. What could possibly require his attention outside in such weather? I moved to the window, trying to peer through the curtain of water, but could see nothing beyond my own reflection. That's when I heard it. A knocking at the door. 3 soft taps, almost hesitant. "Henry," I called, remembering his instructions not to open the door. No answer, just another series of knocks, more insistent this time. "Henry, is that you?" A voice came through the door then, but it wasn't Henry's gruff baritone. It was higher, strained, as if speaking required great effort. "Let me in," it said. "Please. I'm hurt." I stepped closer to the door. "Who's there?" "Lost." The voice replied, a woman's voice, I thought. So cold. "Please help me." My hand moved toward the latch, a natural response to someone in distress. But Henry's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't open the door. Not until you hear me call your name 3 times. "I can't open the door," I said through the wood. "But Henry will be back soon. He can help you." The silence followed, so complete that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the voice. Then a sound against the door. Not knocking this time, but a slow, deliberate scraping, as if someone were dragging their nails down the wood. "You're already helping him, aren't you?" the voice said, dropping an octave, hardening. "Poor Henry. He can't keep doing this forever." The scraping continued, moving from the door to the walls, circling the cabin. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't right. None of this was right. "What do you want?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The scraping stopped. Then laughter, a sound so hollow and joyless it barely deserved a name, filtered through the walls from all directions at once. "We want what was promised," the voice said, now seemingly right beside my ear despite nothing being there. A way back, a door, a vessel. I nearly jumped out of my skin as something heavy landed on the roof, moving across it with irregular, thumping steps. Not raindrops, not branches, something large, something deliberate. The kerosene lamps flickered violently, then extinguished all at once, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the dim glow of the dying fire. In that moment of near blindness, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in front of me. A new sound rose beneath the rain, a low, harmonized humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Multiple voices, singing without words, a melody so ancient it awakened some primal fear in my gut. The humming built to a fever pitch, then stopped abruptly as something slammed against the door with enough force to make the hinges groan. Again and again, with splintering under the assault. "James!" Henry's voice, from somewhere outside, barely audible over the storm and the assault on the door. "James!" Closer now. The door began to give way, a crack appearing in its center. "James!" Right outside now, the third call. I lunged to the door, throwing the latch and yanking it open. Henry stood there, drenched and wild-eyed, shotgun in hand. Behind him, through the curtain of rain, I caught glimpses of movement, tall, emaciated shapes retreating into the forest, their forms stuttering like bad stop-motion animation. Henry pushed past me into the cabin, slamming the door shut and dropping a heavy wooden bar into brackets I hadn't noticed before. He moved quickly to relight the lamps and stoke the fire. "They're agitated tonight," he said, as casually as if discussing the weather. "More than I've seen in years." What were those things? I demanded, struggling to keep my voice from shaking. Henry sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years and then some. "The lost," he said simply, "or what's left of them." He gestured for me to sit. "They live in the spaces between, not fully here, not fully gone. Normally they keep to themselves deep in the forest, but on certain nights, when the conditions are right, they try to find a way back." "Back where?" "To life," Henry said. "To the world of the living. They need a vessel for that, a body to occupy." He looked at me meaningfully. "A visitor?" My mouth went dry. "You're saying they're ghosts?" "Spirits." Henry shook his head. "Nothing so simple. More like echoes with hunger, memories with teeth." He poured us both another whiskey, his hand steady despite everything. "They've been here since before the forest was a forest. The indigenous peoples knew about them, had rituals to keep them contained. The early settlers learned the hard way what happens when those rituals are neglected. And you, what? Guard against them? I maintain the boundaries," he said. "Make sure they stay where they belong." He took a long sip of whiskey. "Most times it's peaceful work, but during storms like this, the boundaries thin, and they remember what it was like to be alive." I wanted to dismiss it all as the ramblings of an isolated old man, a ghost story told to a stranded traveler. But I couldn't unhear that voice, couldn't unsee those movements in the rain, and the bone-deep cold that had filled the cabin. That hadn't been my imagination. "How did you end up with this job?" I asked, a sad smile across Henry's face. "Same way as you. Car trouble, decades ago. Sought shelter with the previous caretaker." He looked into his glass. "When morning came, my car worked perfectly, but I couldn't leave. Not after what I'd seen. Not knowing what would happen if no one maintained the boundaries." A horrible suspicion began to form in my mind. "Are you saying—" "Everyone makes their own choice," Henry interrupted firmly. "I chose to stay. The man before me chose to stay, but it's always a choice. And if I choose to leave, I ask quietly, "Then you leave," he said simply. "When morning comes, your car will start. The road will take you back to the world you know." He looked at me with those pale blue eyes. "But you'll know what's out here. You'll hear them sometimes, in the rain against your window. You'll glimpse them in the corner of your eye during storms. And you'll wonder who's maintaining the boundaries since you drove away." We sat in silence after that, listening to the storm gradually subsiding. Eventually, Henry offered me the bed while he kept watch from the armchair. Despite my racing mind, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of pale figures moving through rain, calling my name in voices almost, but not quite human. I woke at dawn to birdsong and silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, sunlight filtering through the pines. Henry was gone, but he'd left coffee brewing on the stove and a hand-drawn map on the table, showing the way back to the main road. There was a note beside it. "The choice is yours. If you decide to go, the key to the cabin is under the blue stone by the door. If you ever need to return, you'll find your way." I left the cabin and walked back to my car, following his directions. The Honda started on the first try, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, looking back toward where the cabin stood hidden among the trees. The rational part of my brain insisted that I'd experienced some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Carbon monoxide from the fireplace, perhaps, or something in that whiskey. Maybe Henry was just a lonely old man who spun tales to stranded travelers for company. But I knew better. I'd heard them. I'd felt them. And now that I was aware, I couldn't unknow their existence. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. I had a life waiting for me, a job, friends, responsibilities. I couldn't simply disappear into the forest because of one strange night. That was 3 years ago. I made it back to Jacksonville, resumed my normal life. But Henry was right about one thing. I do hear them now when it rains, especially on nights like tonight, when the storm beats against my windows with unnatural persistence. Sometimes I find myself looking up routes through the Ocala National Forest, finger hovering over the map where I think that cabin might be. Because the thing Henry didn't tell me, the thing I've come to realize over time, is that once you glimpse what lives in the boundaries, you're already part of their world. The choice isn't whether to acknowledge them or not. The choice is whether to face them on your terms or theirs. I think I'll be taking a drive soon, back through Ocala, back to where it all began. Because lately, the rain hasn't just been bringing their whispers. It's been bringing their footsteps, circling closer each time. And I'd rather face whatever waits in that forest and sit here, night after night, waiting for my door to splinter inward. Are you listening to this in the rain? Turn away from the window. Don't look too closely at the patterns the droplets make, the shapes they might suggest. And if you're driving through Central Florida and your car begins to stutter on a forest road during a storm, keep driving. Whatever you do, keep driving, because some shelters are more dangerous. The rain against your window right now. Does it sound different to you? Listen closely. There's a pattern to it, isn't there? A rhythm, almost like whispered words. That's what I first noticed that night in Coral Springs. The rain was trying to tell me something. I should have listened sooner. I moved to Florida 5 years ago for a fresh start. My divorce had been finalized. My children were grown and busy with their own lives, and nothing was keeping me in Michigan anymore. Florida seemed like the opposite of everything I wanted to leave behind. Warm instead of cold, vibrant instead of faded, full of possibilities instead of memories. I found a modest house in Coral Springs, a planned community in the northwest of Fort Lauderdale. It wasn't directly on the beach, which kept it affordable, but it was close enough that I could drive to the ocean whenever I wanted. What really sold me on the place was the network of canals that wound to the neighborhood like veins, giving many properties, including mine, waterfront views. My real estate agent had been oddly evasive about the canals. Man-made, she'd said dismissively when I asked about them. Part of the original development to manage water flow and drainage. When I pressed for more details, how deep they were, whether people fished or kayaked in them, she quickly changed the subject to the updated kitchen appliances. I should have recognized her discomfort as a warning, but the house was perfect. Single story with a screened lanai overlooking one of the wider canals, mature palm trees providing privacy, and most importantly, it was within my budget. I signed the papers without further questions. The first few months were everything I'd hoped for. I settled into a pleasant routine. Morning coffee on the lanai, watching herons stalk through the shallows of canal. Afternoons exploring my new state. Evenings reading or streaming films as a Florida sunset painted my walls in shades of orange and pink. I even made a few acquaintances in the neighborhood, though no one I'd call a close friend yet. It wasn't until the rainy season began that I noticed something odd about the canal behind my house. While the others in the neighborhood would rise and fall with rainfall, mine maintained an eerily consistent water level regardless of whether we'd had drought or deluge. At first, I attributed this to some clever engineering in the drainage system, but then I began to notice other peculiarities. The wildlife behaved strangely around my stretch of canal. Birds that wade freely in other sections would stop at an invisible boundary line near my property, staring into the water before abruptly flying away. Neighborhood pets refused to approach the water's edge, and I once watched my neighbor's otherwise fearless Labrador retriever strain against his leash, whimpering, rather than come within 10 feet of the canal bank. Then there were the sounds. At night, especially when it rained, I would hear splashing that seemed too deliberate to be fish. Sometimes, I thought I could make out voices beneath the patter of raindrops, whispers so faint they might have been tricks of the wind or my imagination slipping into dreams. But they became increasingly difficult to dismiss, especially when they began to sound like my name. I mentioned these observations casually to my next-door neighbor, Eleanor, a retiree who had lived in Coral Springs for over 20 years. We were collecting our mail at the community boxes when I brought it up, framing it as a curiosity rather than a concern. Have you ever noticed anything strange about the canal behind our houses? I asked. The water level never seems to change, even during heavy rain. Eleanor's hand froze midway through retrieving a letter. She didn't look at me as she carefully tucked her mail into her bag. The canals are deeper than they appear, she said finally. The original developers dug them wrong. Too deep. City's been trying to fix the problem for years. That doesn't explain why the water level never changes. I pressed gently. She glanced around as if checking whether anyone else was within earshot, then lowered her voice. Listen, Caroline, you're new here, so you don't know, but some things are better left alone. If I were you, I wouldn't spend too much time looking at that canal. And whatever you do, don't go near it during a full moon, especially not when it's raining. Before I could ask what she meant, she hurried away, leaving me standing by the mailboxes with more questions than before. That evening, a quick internet search for Coral Springs Canal's history yielded nothing unusual, just the expected information about the planned community's development in the 1960s and the standard drainage infrastructure. But a deeper dive into local forums and community boards turned up scattered references to what locals called the Midnight Canal, a section of waterway that supposedly shifted location over the years, but was always recognizable by its unnaturally still water and the absence of wildlife. According to these posts, the Midnight Canal was the site of several disappearances dating back to the community's earliest days. Most were dismissed as drowning accidents or runaways, but the posts hinted at a pattern. The disappearances always occurred during rainstorms on the night of a full moon, and the victims were always people who had recently moved to homes adjacent to that particular stretch of canal. I closed my laptop, telling myself these were just urban legends, the kind that spring up in any community. But when I glanced at my calendar and realized the next full moon was only 3 days away, a chill ran through me despite the humid Florida evening. That night, I dreamed the canal. In my dream, I stood on my lanai watching the water, which seemed darker than usual, almost opaque. As I stared, the surface began to ripple, though there was no wind. The ripples formed concentric circles, as if something large was rising from below. I tried to move, to go back inside, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Then, just as a shape began to break the water's surface, I woke up, my nightgown soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning. For the next 2 days, I found myself avoiding the lanai and keeping the blinds closed on the canal-facing windows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting internet ghost stories and Eleanor's cryptic warning get to me. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me, a persistent feeling of being watched whenever I was near the water. On the evening of the full moon, a storm rolled in, one of those sudden violent Florida downpours that transformed day into night in minutes. I was in my kitchen preparing dinner when the rain began, a few heavy drops quickly becoming a torrential sheet of water battered my roof and windows. The power flickered once, twice, then stabilized. I moved through the house, closing windows against the rain, when a sound cut through the storm's roar, a clear, bell-like tone, almost musical. It seemed to be coming from the lanai. Curious despite my apprehension, I approached the sliding glass door that led to the screened porch. The lanai was dark except for the intermittent flash of lightning, but in those brief illuminations, I could see that the canal had changed. The normally still water was churning, not with the chaotic motion of wind-driven waves, but with a rhythmic, almost purposeful undulation. And floating on the surface were dozens of small lights, pale blue orbs that bobbed gently on the water, unaffected by the turmoil around them. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. The rational part of my brain suggested bioluminescent algae, perhaps, or some electrical phenomenon related to the storm. But deeper instincts screamed that I was witnessing something unnatural, something that should not exist in the mundane world I thought I inhabited. As I watched, frozen in fascination and fear, the lights began to move, no longer randomly distributed across the canal. They formed a line leading from the center of the waterway directly to my property, to my lanai, to me. The musical tone came again, louder this time, resolving into what sounded like a voice calling my name, not from outside, but from the depths of the canal itself. Caroline, it called. The syllables stretched and distorted as if passing through water. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I must be dreaming again. Or perhaps I'd fallen asleep reading those ridiculous forum posts and was having a nightmare fueled by suggestible imagination. But even as I retreated into the living room, the voice followed, clearer now, yet still with that strange underwater quality. Caroline, we've been waiting for you. The lights outside grew brighter, their blue glow now visible through the closed blinds, casting wavering shadows across my walls. The rain intensified, no longer sounding like water hitting my roof, but like countless fingers tapping, demanding entry. I grabbed my phone to call someone. The police? What would I tell them? That mysterious lights and voices were coming from the canal behind my house? They'd think I was having a mental breakdown. Maybe I was. As I debated what to do, the power went out completely, plunging the house into darkness broken only by the blue glow seeping around the edges of my blinds and the occasional flash of lightning. My phone showed no signal, not surprising during a heavy storm. The tapping of my windows grew more insistent, no longer in rhythm with the rain, but forming a distinct pattern, a code, a message. Without thinking, I found myself moving toward the lanai door, my hand reaching for the handle as if guided by some force outside myself. A sudden, sharp knocking at my front door broke the spell. I jumped, my hand falling away from the lanai door. The knocking came again, urgent and human. "Caroline," a voice called, Eleanor's voice. "Caroline, are you in there? Open up quickly." I hurried to the front door, relief washing over me at the sound of another person. When I opened it, Eleanor stood on my doorstep, drenched despite her raincoat and umbrella, her face lined with worry. "Thank God," she said, pushing past me into the house. I was afraid I might be too late. Too late for what? I asked, closing the door against the howling wind and rain. "Eleanor, what's happening?" Instead of answering, she moved swiftly through my house, closing blinds that were already closed, checking that all windows were secured. When she reached the lanai door, she stopped, her body tensing at the blue glow visible around its edges. "They've already begun calling you," she said quietly. "I should have warned you more clearly, but I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. No one ever does until it's too late." "Who? What are you talking about?" Eleanor turned to face me, her expression grave in the dim light. "When they built Coral Springs, they disturbed something that was here long before any of us, something that lives in the water. The developers tried to bury it under concrete and suburban planning, but it found ways to reach the surface through the canals they dug." A particularly loud crack of thunder punctuated her words, making us both jump. The blue light from the canal pulsed in response, growing brighter. "Most people call them the Descended," Eleanor continued. "They're not ghosts, not exactly. More like echoes, memories with hunger. They were a tribe that lived here thousands of years ago, worshipping water spirits. When conquistadors came, the tribe retreated into the Everglades, into the water itself, making some kind of pact with whatever they worshipped. They gave up their humanity to survive. Under other circumstances, I might have dismissed this as the ramblings of a superstitious mind, but with that unearthly blue light filling my home and the memory of those voices calling my name, I found myself believing her. Every full moon when it rains, they rise, Eleanor said, looking for new tribe members. They called it whoever lives nearest their current doorway. That's your house now. It was a Rodriguez family before you, but they moved away after their teenage son disappeared. She grimaced. The official report said he ran away, but I saw him that night, walking into the canal as if in a trance. The water took him, and 3 days later, blue lights appeared behind my house. A cold dread settled in my stomach. So these things are moving from house to house. Eleanor nodded grimly. They need an invitation to enter our world fully. Someone to open the way. Once they have that, they claim that soul and move on to the next potential gateway. And they want me to be that invitation tonight. I whispered, glancing toward the lanai where the blue light had intensified. Yes, but we can stop it. We can close the doorway, at least until the next full moon. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small cloth bag, salt, iron filings, and sawgrass knots. An old Seminole method for sealing water doorways. She pressed it into my hand. You need to cast this into the canal at the point where the lights are brightest. It has to be you, the one they're calling. I stare at the innocuous-looking bag, then back at Eleanor. Why are you helping me? If they move from house to house, wouldn't letting them take me mean your house is safe. A sad smile crossed her face. They took my husband 15 years ago. I've been fighting them ever since, learning everything I can, warning newcomers when they arrive. She squeezed my arm. But we have to hurry. The longer they call, the stronger their pull becomes. As if to emphasize her point, the musical tone came again, louder and more compelling than before. Caroline, join us. We're waiting. The voice didn't sound threatening. It was beautiful, soothing, promising belonging and peace. I felt a pull toward the lanai door, an almost physical tug. Eleanor gripped my arm tighter. That's how it starts, she warned. They make it seem welcoming. Don't listen. Drawing a deep breath, I clutched the cloth bag and moved toward the lanai door. Eleanor followed close behind, her presence somehow grounding me against the increasingly powerful call. When I slid open the door, the full force of both storm and supernatural light hit us. The rain had formed a vertical sheet at the edge of the lanai, defying gravity and physics, creating a translucent barrier between the porch and the canal beyond. Through this watery wall, I could see the blue lights, hundreds of them now, forming a bridge from the center of the canal to my lanai steps. And there were figures moving among the lights, human-shaped but wrong somehow, their proportions elongated, their movements too fluid to be natural. They swayed and gestured, beckoning. Caroline. They called in unison, their voices merging into a hypnotic chorus. We've been so lonely. Join us. I felt myself stepping forward, drawn by their call. They seemed so sad, so in need of companionship. Surely it wouldn't hurt to go closer, to see them better. Caroline. Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the enchantment. The bag. Now. With tremendous effort, I tore my gaze from the figures and focused on the cloth bag in my hand. I needed to throw it at the brightest concentration of lights, which was directly at the base of my lanai steps where water met land. The figures sensed my intention. Their calls became more urgent, their movements more agitated. The watery barrier between us rippled violently. Join us willingly, they called, or we will take you unwilling. The doorway must open tonight. Throw it now. Eleanor shouted over the combined roar of storm and supernatural voices. I pulled my arm back and flung the bag with all my strength toward the brightest cluster of lights. For a terrible moment, it seemed to hang suspended in the air, caught in the unnatural barrier of rain. Then it broke through, landing with a small splash among the blue lights. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The figures contorted in what appeared to be pain, their forms twisting in ways that defied anatomy. The beautiful voices transformed into shrieks that made my ears ache. The blue lights flickered, dimmed, and began to retreat toward the center of the canal. But they didn't go quietly. As they withdrew, one figure remained at the edge of the water, its form more defined than the others. In the glow of the retreating lights, I could make out features that were almost human. Eyes that reflected blue fire, a mouth stretched too wide across a gaunt face. It raised an impossibly long arm and pointed directly at me. Until the next moon, it said, its voice now a harsh, bubbling whisper. We are patient. We have eternity. Its gaze shifted to Eleanor. You cannot protect her forever. Guardian, your time grows short. Then it too retreated, sinking beneath the surface of the canal as the blue lights winked out one by one. The rain returned to its natural downward fall, and apart from the normal storm sounds, the night was suddenly blessedly quiet. I stood shaking on my lanai, Eleanor's supportive hand on my shoulder. Is it over? I whispered. For now, she said grimly, until the next full moon with rain. She guided me back inside, closing and locking the lanai door firmly behind us. You should stay with me tonight. It's not safe here, even with the doorway temporarily sealed. I nodded numbly, too shocked to argue. As we prepared to dash through the rain to her house next door, a thought occurred to me. You called yourself a guardian. What did that thing mean about your time growing short? Eleanor's face looked suddenly older in the dim light. Fighting them takes a toll, she said simply. I've been doing it a long time. But that's a conversation for another night. Right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. That was 6 months ago. I've had 5 more full moons since then, 3 with rain. Each time, Eleanor and I performed the ritual with the cloth bags, keeping the doorways sealed. Each time, it gets harder, the pull stronger, their voice is more difficult to resist. Eleanor's health is failing, too rapidly for natural causes. She says it's the price of being a guardian, of denying the descendant their chosen gateway for so long. She's been teaching me everything she knows, preparing me to continue after she's gone. I've tried researching the history she told me, looking for confirmation or, honestly, refutation. I want so badly for this to be some elaborate delusion we're both caught in. But the more I dig, the more evidence I find buried in old Seminole legends, Spanish expedition journals, and a suspiciously high number of unsolved disappearances in Coral Springs during rainy full moons. I considered selling my house and moving away, but Eleanor insists it wouldn't help. They've marked you, she told me. Wherever you go, water will find you. Better to stand and fight where we know the terrain. So I stay. I learn. I prepare for each full moon with increasing dread. And I listen to the rain, try and distinguish between natural patterns and their voices calling my name. They never stop completely. Even on ordinary nights like tonight, when the moon is just a sliver in the sky, I can hear them whispering beneath the rainfall, reminding me they're waiting, promising belonging if I surrender, threatening horrors if I resist. The worst part is, sometimes I find myself wondering what it would be like to answer their call, to walk into canal, and join whatever exists beneath its surface. Would it really be so terrible? To belong to something ancient and powerful? To never be alone again? These thoughts terrify me more than the entities themselves. Listen to the rain outside your window. Really listen. If you start to hear patterns, rhythms that sound almost like words, if you find water behaving strangely around you, maintaining impossible stillness or moving against gravity, if you see blue lights reflected in puddles during a full moon, remember my story. Find salt, iron, and local grasses. Find your own Eleanor before it's too late, because the descended are patient. They have eternity, and they're always looking for new gateways into our world. Listen to that rain tapping on your window. It reminds me of fingers, patient, persistent fingers asking to be let in. That's the thing about water in Florida. It's always trying to find a way inside, into your home, into the earth, into you. I learned this the hard way 3 years ago at Blue Spring State Park. I still wake up some nights, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced I'm back there, suspended in that impossible darkness, listening to voices that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, but they did. And sometimes when the rain falls just right, I can hear them again. I was a hydrogeologist then, studying Florida's complex underground water systems. The state's at the top of a vast limestone platform riddled with caverns, tunnels, and springs, a subterranean world largely unmapped and unexplored. My research focused on sinkholes, how they form, how to predict them, how to prevent the catastrophic damage they cause when they suddenly appear beneath homes or highways. Blue Spring was a perfect research site, a first magnitude spring connected to Florida aquifer, with crystal clear water that remains a constant 72 degrees year-round. Divers had mapped portions of the underwater cave system, but much of it remained unexplored. My plan was simple. Camp nearby for a week, collecting water samples and sonar readings to better understand the limestone dissolution process that eventually leads to sinkholes. The park ranger who processed my research permit was a sun-weathered man named Hank with a slow, deliberate speech of someone who chooses his words carefully. "You're setting up near the South Trail?" he asked, studying my application. "Yes." At the designated primitive campsite. It's closest to where I need to take samples. Hank tapped his pen against the desk. That area has been experiencing some unusual activity lately. Might be better if you use one of the main campground sites instead. What kind of unusual activity? I asked. Professional curiosity piqued. He hesitated. Ground subsidence, most likely. We've had a lot of rain this season. Makes the limestone unstable. He looked up at me. I know you study this stuff, but reading about sinkholes and being swallowed by one or two different things. I'll be careful, I promise. Actually, evidence of recent subsidence would be valuable for my research. Hank signed permit with obvious reluctance. Your call. Just stay alert, especially at night. And if you hear anything strange, head back to the main area immediately. Strange like what? I press. You know how sound travels through caves? How it can distort. He shrugged. People hear things sometimes. Probably just water movements or wildlife. But it can be unsettling when you're alone. I nodded, though I suspected he was being deliberately vague. Park rangers often downplay potential dangers while still trying to warn visitors. A delicate balance between scaring people off and keeping them safe. The South Trail campsite was indeed isolated, set in a clearing surrounded by lush subtropical vegetation about a half-mile from the spring head. I pitched my tent, arranged my research equipment, and spent the remainder of the day taking preliminary water samples from the spring run, the stream that flows from the spring to the St. Johns River. Everything seemed perfectly normal that first day. Tourists in canoes paddled the clear spring waters, marveling at the occasional manatee. Divers in black wetsuits descended into the spring vent, disappearing into the underwater cave system. I noted water pH levels, temperature gradients, and collected limestone samples from exposed outcroppings. Standard research protocol. It wasn't until twilight, when the park closed to day visitors, that I noticed the first oddity. The wildlife went quiet all at once. Not the gradual transition from day to night sounds, but an abrupt, unnatural silence. Even the insects stopped their constant chorus, leaving only the gentle gurgle of flowing water. Then came the vibration, so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining it. A faint trembling the ground beneath my feet, like the lowest note of a bass speaker. I pressed my palm to the earth, feeling the limestone beneath the thin layer of soil quiver, with a rhythm too regular to be seismic activity. My scientific mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Underground water pressure changes, distant construction, though that was unlikely in a state park, or perhaps a large animal moving through the underbrush. I made notes in my research journal, deciding to set up seismic monitors the next day to record the vibrations. Night fell completely as I prepared a simple dinner over my camp stove. The vibrations continued intermittently, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time before resuming with greater intensity. With each pause and resumption, the silence seemed to deepen, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, listening. I checked the weather forecast on my satellite phone. A thunderstorm was expected to move through overnight. Not unusual for Florida, but potentially problematic for my more sensitive equipment. I secured everything as best I could and retreated to my tent as the first raindrops began to fall. The storm arrived with surprising suddenness, rain hammering against my tent with an intensity that made conversation impossible. Not that I had anyone to talk to out there. Lightning illuminated the forest in strobing flashes, thunder cracking so closely behind that I knew the storm was directly overhead. It was during one of these lightning flashes that I saw it. A shadow moving outside my tent, cast upon the nylon wall by the brief illumination. A human silhouette, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly distorted. I froze, heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely audible over the downpour. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but in the brief silence between thunderclaps, I heard something else, a sound like water moving, but not the rain, more like the deliberate sloshing of someone wading through a puddle, circling my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and, after a moment's hesitation, unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the campsite into a network of puddles and rivulets. My light caught nothing but falling water and swaying vegetation. Feeling foolish, I secured the tent and settled back into my sleeping bag. The combination of stress, isolation, and the storm was clearly making me jumpy. I focused on the research questions that had brought me here, running through the data I collected so far, planning tomorrow's work. The vibration beneath the ground intensified with the storm. No longer subtle, but a distinct trembling that made my water bottle dance across the tent floor. That was concerning. Increased groundwater pressure during heavy rain was exactly the kind of trigger that could cause a sinkhole to form. Perhaps Hank's warning about ground subsidence hadn't been as casual as it seemed. I should have packed up then, should have retreated to the main campground, or even left the park entirely. But professional curiosity overrode caution. This was exactly the kind of real-time sinkhole formation process I had come to study. Instead of leaving, I set up one of my seismographs inside the tent, watching as it registered the increasing vibrations. That's when I heard the voices. They came with the rain, emerging from its rhythm so gradually that at first, I thought it was just my brain finding patterns in random noise, like seeing faces in clouds. But the patterns grew more distinct, more deliberate, until they were unmistakably voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the rain on my tent, from the ground beneath me, from the very air itself. Multiple voices overlapping, speaking in whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The voices weren't coming from outside me. They were somehow bypassing my ears entirely. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. This isn't funny. The voices paused, as if surprised at being addressed directly. Then they returned, clearer now, though still with that strange, liquid quality, as if the speakers were talking underwater. Found US. I caught fragments. So long. And come down. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the ranger station, but found no signal. Not unexpected during a severe storm. I was on my own, at least until morning. The ground shuddered beneath me. A violent tremor that sent my equipment sliding across the tent floor. Outside, I heard a sound like tearing fabric, but amplified, deeper, the sound of something fundamental giving way. I scrambled for my boots and raincoat. Whatever was happening, staying in the tent no longer felt safe. As I yanked on my coat, my flashlight beam caught movement through the mesh window of my tent. Not the shadow I'd seen earlier, but the ground itself rippling like disturbed water. I burst from the tent into the pouring rain, just as the earth began to sink beneath it. A perfect circle of ground approximately 20 feet in diameter was subsiding. Not violently, but with an almost graceful, deliberate motion, like a stage platform being lowered. My tent, half my equipment, and what would have been me disappeared into a widening dark maw in the earth. I scrambled backward, slipping in the mud, watching in horror and scientific fascination as a textbook sinkhole formed before my eyes. But there was something wrong about it. Sinkholes typically form chaotically, with ground collapsing unevenly as limestone dissolves. This was too perfect, too controlled, as if the earth were being opened deliberately, carefully, like a door. The voices grew louder as the sinkhole widened, and now I could understand them clearly. Come see. Come down. We've been waiting. The door is open. Water was filling the sinkhole, not just rain, but water welling up from below, much like a spring but in reverse. In the sporadic lightning flashes, I could see that the water was moving against gravity, forming patterns that water should make, spirals and curves that held their shape rather than dissipating. And there were shapes in the water, suggestions of forms that might have been human once, moving with fluid grace through the impossible patterns. They reached upward from the sinkhole, not with hands, but with tendrils of water that maintained their form even in the pounding rain. "You study us," one voice said, somehow distinct from the chorus now. "You measure and analyze and try to understand, but you've never asked what we are, what lies beneath. What are you?" I found myself asking, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "We are the below people," the voice replied, a tendril of water rising higher than the others, forming a vaguely humanoid upper body. "We were here before the limestone, before the water. We helped shape this land, create its rivers and springs and lakes. We are its caretakers." Another voice joined in, its water form rising beside the first. "But we are forgotten. Humans built over us, polluted our waters, dropped their trash and chemicals into our home. We retreat further below with each generation. Why show yourselves to me?" I asked, struggling to process what I was seeing through both terror and scientific skepticism. This couldn't be real. Water doesn't hold such shapes. Voices don't emerge from rain. "Because you listen," the first figure said. "You measure the vibrations, our songs. You study the water, our blood. You understand the limestone, our bones." The sinkhole had stabilized now, a perfect circle perhaps 30 feet across, and so deep that its bottom was lost in shadow despite my flashlight's beam. The water level within it was rising steadily, the impossible shapes becoming more defined as they approached the surface. "Come down," they urged in unison. "See our world, learn our ways, become our voice to those above." Part of me, the scientist, the explorer, was tempted. If these beings were real, what an extraordinary discovery. And if they weren't, if this was some hallucination brought on by stress or an undiscovered gas leaking from the limestone, wouldn't it be better to know? I took a step toward the sinkhole's edge, drawn by curiosity as much as by the hypnotic quality of their voices. The water shapes reached toward me, elongating, their features becoming more distinct. Faces emerging from the fluid forms, with eyes that reflected like polished stone. "I'll come back," I heard myself saying, in daylight, with proper equipment. The water shapes recoiled slightly, and I felt their disappointment like a physical wave. "The door does not open often," one said. "The alignment of water and stone and sky is rare. It might be years before we can reach through again." "I need time," I insisted, taking a step back from the edge. "This is too much to process." The figures conferred among themselves, their water forms intermingling in complex patterns. Finally, the apparent leader addressed me again. "We will give you a token, a way to find us again when you are ready." A tendril of water extended toward me, holding something that glinted even in the dim light. A perfect sphere would appear to be crystal or glass, about the size of a marble. Against all reason, I reached out and took it. The sphere was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a faint inner light that shifted between blue and green, the colors of Florida's springs. "When you are ready to learn our truths, place this in natural water under a full moon," the figure said. "We will know, and we will open the way." Before I could respond, a tremendous thunderclap shook the forest. Lightning struck a tree not 50 yards from where I stood, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, the water figures had retreated into the sinkhole, which was now filling rapidly with ordinary-looking rainwater. By morning, the sinkhole had become what appeared to be a natural pond, perfectly circular, its water an impossible blue that reminded me of Blue Spring itself. My tent and missing equipment were nowhere to be seen, presumably lost to whatever space existed below. I reported the sinkhole to Ranger Hank, describing it as a standard limestone collapse triggered by the heavy rain. I said nothing about water shapes or voices. He sent a geological survey team to assess the stability of the area, and they found nothing unusual beyond the remarkable symmetry of the formation. The pond was taped off, marked as a new geological feature on park maps, and life went on. I abandoned my research at Blue Spring, claiming equipment loss as the reason. In reality, I couldn't bring myself to return to that pond. Not yet. The crystal sphere remained in my possession, locked in a desk drawer in my office. Sometimes at night, especially when it rains, I can hear a faint humming coming from inside the drawer, a vibration with the same rhythm as what I felt before the sinkhole opened. I've spent 3 years researching folklore and indigenous legends about Florida's underground water systems. The Seminole and Miccosukee tribes have stories about water people who live beneath the springs, guardians of the aquifer who can shape water to their will. Earlier Spanish accounts mention explorers who claim to have found entrances to an underground civilization near what we now call the Floridan aquifer. I tell myself these are just stories, attempts to explain the mysterious nature of Florida's springs and sinkholes before science provided better answers. But then I look at the sphere in my drawer, watch it pulse with impossible light, and I wonder, the next full moon is in 3 days. I've taken a leave of absence from my university position and packed my car with scientific equipment, spectrometers, sample collection kits, underwater cameras. If what I experienced was real, it deserves proper documentation. If it wasn't, well, I need to know that too. I'll be at Blue Spring again, at the edge of that perfect circular pond, sphere in hand. I'll finally have my answers. Unless, of course, they have something else in mind. Listen to the rain. Really listen. Do you hear how certain droplets seem to fall with more purpose than others? How they sometimes form patterns on your window that linger longer than they should? That's no accident. Water remembers. Water speaks. Water listens. And in Florida, where the ground is hollow and water flows in darkness beneath your feet, sometimes water wants. So be careful when you camp near one of those beautiful blue springs. Be especially careful if you notice the ground trembling in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. And if you hear voices in the rain, voices that know your name, call you to come down, come see, come join, well, that's when you should run. Run and don't look back. Because once the below people offer you a token, once they've chosen you as their witness, the door will always be waiting to open again. And next time, I might not be strong enough to walk away.